Hello, everybody. Welcome to Hamster's Hobby Hang, Cities Untold Lowtown Edition. I got a very special guest here. Won multiple Best Painted Armies, including U.S. Open, Age of Sigmar, multiple Golden Demon finalist pins, super accomplished painter, uh, big tournament player. Super happy to have him here, Martin Orlando. So thank you for spending some time with us here.
You for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So we're just the usual hobby hang, but on a Wednesday I got one of our new non-human townsfolk miniatures. If this is your first time joining us, we are running a Kickstarter right now called Cities Untold Lowtown, kind of a ramshackle town or village. Lots of brand new systems, new roof geometry, so check that out if you haven't seen it yet. But otherwise, we're just gonna paint and chat. So, Martin, I've been acquainted with you with some gaming groups, mostly on social media throughout New York City and the tri-state area, but I haven't chatted with you a whole lot. So I'm curious, just what's the backstory? How did you get into miniature painting, playing war games, and the whole hobby?
Yeah. Again, thank you for having me. A lot of the Dwarven Forge stuff looks pretty cool. I might pick it up someday. I've been maybe if you switch from Dwarven Forge to Elven Forge, of course, but I'm biased.
Yes.
Where did I get started? Where did I get started? I started as a little kid finding a Games Workshop in a mall down in South Jersey, and we'd passed it several times. Me and in the mid 2000s, what's all the rage, Beyblade card games, Nintendo stuff like that. And I'm kind of growing out of those things. And I love the Lord of the Rings films. And every time I walk by the Games Workshop, you see the Balrog, you see the Fellowship, um, and of course you see Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40K, Blood Bowl, and it's like, oh, what is that? Me being eternally arts and crafts like, it's like, oh, you get to paint them? Maybe one day. And of course, one day was one too many, and we finally, our curiosity pulled us inside. I had a demo game, I believe through Lord of the Rings, and then Warhammer 40K, and I was kind of hooked effectively for life now. And even as I went through high school, college, getting a full time job, I never quite stayed away because I know some people have that lull period where you finish education, get into higher education. It's like, well, they leave, they see something cool on the internet, they come back, and it's like a whole new world. I've been through the hobby through thick and thin for the past like 15, 16 years now, possibly a little longer. And one of the things that has definitely stuck with me is the Warhammer Fantasy into Age of Sigmar side. And eventually, as I've as when fantasy became Age of Sigmar, I really wanted to get more involved with the community to help budding game try and like reach more people, so I could have on a selfish level more people to play with, but also try and make sure that the game was something that a lot of it really could be something worth celebrating and playing it at larger events. And that eventually pulled me into it's like, well, if this game needs a TO, I might as well TO it. And so I've helped volunteer at Nova. I'm work with Frontline Gaming once a year to TO their Atlantic City Open event for Age of Sigmar. So I do a little bit of everything. I love painting, I love gaming, uh, and I run events. So there's a few things in the hobby that I don't contribute to.
That's awesome, and you're good at all of it. I saw a post
Thank you.
about an army that's like, yeah, went 4-1. Also, the army won painting awards. Also, this. Also, like you just crush it on
Uh,
all fronts.
uh, I feel like Adepticon was a little bit of a fluke on my part, and the goal is to make that more consistent. Because while I did do very well at Adepticon last year, to a point where I don't know if I could ever top it, the rest of that year I did not do as well in terms of how my games went. And so I'm definitely on a sort of journey of towards holistic improvement of becoming more consistent in the game. Because I do enjoy Warhammer too much to be content with being a little mediocre, tending towards below average in my games. And that's not a path for everyone. I do encourage people to try and enjoy the hobby as they see fit, enjoy it at their own pace. And sometimes for me, I enjoy too much of everything in the hobby to be content with staying in one lane. This year, the goal is to maybe minimize how many times I go 2 and 3. I'm not going to go 5-0 at any tournament anytime soon. But the goal is to try and get there incrementally. I don't get to play as often as the top players in the world. Some of them are my friends, thankfully, so that does make practicing a little better. If I want to prepare for a tournament, I can get in touch with some of them who are even live in New York City. Some of the best players in the world live in New York City, and it's not necessarily like it gets to steamroll me in 90 minutes. It's definitely we play a full game. We talk it through. I learn valuable lessons, and those in turn help me improve my gaming ability.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to get painted miniatures and enough D6s to actually finally get games going again, because I did have that journey of got into it as a kid, went off to college, moved out here, didn't paint for years, and now of course being at Dwarven Forge, I'm all about games again. So
Mhm.
I just want to get back to like the, 50 to 100 models per side just type of experience, get enough for that going again.
Oh yeah, and as we were talking a little bit before the stream, one of the ways to meld those two, especially with the terrain that your studio makes, a lot of skirmish games, I think are a future backbone of this hobby. People who are coming into it from other games or other fandoms may not be used to scale models. The concept of you model it may require assembly, and it's almost always not painted. And part of the hobby includes you don't have to paint them, but there is a little bit of an expectation that you want to customize them. You want to put your personal touch on model kits made by these various companies. It doesn't have to be Games Workshop. It can be Reaper. It can be War Machine, or any number of these new 3D print companies that put out STL files and such. You're encouraged to express yourself on the canvas provided if you can't sculpt. Not everyone can sculpt, of course. Uh, I can't, that's for sure. And you have all these skirmish games, especially what Games Workshop offers, Warcry and Kill Team. You only need 7 to 9 models ish per side, possibly less. A friend of mine, Vincent Venturella of Warhammer Weekly fame, he releases these miniatures agnostic games every year, which include Reign in Hell and Space Station Zero, which actually their balance is predicated on how many models do you want in your warband. It's like 4, 5, 6, or 7, something around that number. And because you have a set amount of models, what they do and how they're balanced is built into those easy to learn rules. And so you can then go find any models which might fit the theme or description you're looking for and paint them up that way. And coupled with the modular terrain that you guys make, I definitely think this could create some sick or cry boards, or something for a similar board game, which takes very little space in a space like New York City. We're fighting for it. I don't know, for those who have ever seen the Games Workshop in Manhattan, which has been here. It celebrated its 25th anniversary last year. It's like the size of, like, some bedrooms have more square footage than that Games Workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, I've picked up Rain in Hell, and I've been meaning to get some folks at the office to play that. Um and I hadn't looked at Space Station Zero yet, but I love that idea of like the balance is based on how many models you have. It's just like, what do you have ready to go? You can get started right away. Just the accessibility is awesome. And it's cool to see, hobbyists turned YouTubers create create a brand new game. Like that's so cool.
Yeah. Vince is one in a million because he came from game design as a hobby. Like, I think he was a YouTuber last. He was already doing all of these things, which was pretty cool. And I've met so many creative people through various mediums, and some of them don't even have social media, but they stay in touch through like local clubs and stuff like that. And I always tell people that if they're ever going to a major convention, like, yes, you're gonna there's a good opportunity, especially in our niche fandom, that you might run into someone like Ninjon, like Miniac or Vince or Grouper Town Hobbies. But you're also going to run into people who you've never seen before, and you're not really going to see like on the internet very much either. It's just not their thing, or they just don't have the time for it because they're either raising a family or they, as we saw on Worm Community last week, they work for the Royal Navy in Antarctica, so it's not easy for them to post to the internet very often. But they still manage to bring their Warhammer figures down to the South Pole and play games. Uh, and uh, yeah, I really recommend if people go to these conventions, keep an open mind. You never know if you're going to meet in terms of like just the wild creativity. Last year, I don't know if you stopped by the AOS hall and saw the 14-foot tall vampire castle.
I
I'm not joking.
Wow.
It's 14. It was 14 feet tall. You could see it from outside the ballroom. Uh, the we definitely on the Age of Sigmar side of things love to. I don't want to say overcompensate because it's like the idea of bigger and more bombastic is the point. So on the competitive side, it's like, oh, do you really need display boards that big to compete? And it's like, no, they're competing in a separate competition. It's part of the tournament. It has its own separate awards. Let them go crazy. And it's usually like the same 8 to 10 hobbyists who are they go away for a year. They stroke their beard or maybe non-existent beard, and it's like, what can I build that's absolutely crazy? And you get people with like infinity mirrors and a 14-foot tall blood castle. I have no idea what's going to be at the event this year. Usually you can tell if you follow the right people on Twitter because they post teaser photos and stuff. And yeah, some of these people post teaser photos about their projects, even though they only show it off at one contest. They might not even be able to build the whole thing in one spot because they've run out of room from floor to ceiling in their basement, which is what happened with the blood castle. I for one can't wait. I always wish I could bring more to Adepticon in terms of hobby contest stuff, and but it's always a joy to see. Take pictures, save them for later, and maybe I can take a piece here or there in terms of ideas and incorporate them into my work for the rest of the year.
Yeah, it was so fun to go last year. I definitely saw just like the giant Space Marine statue and just all of the enormous, different constructions. And of course, like the Golden Demon, you got the large model down to the single individual stuff. Like the variety is wild.
Yeah. It's great to see Golden Demon come back to America. It'll be interesting this year because Games Workshop brought back Games Day to an extent with something called Warhammer Fest. But now instead of Warhammer Fest being one day, it's like a whole like weekend convention. And but it's like 2 weeks after Adepticon because I don't know if they could have fit it anywhere else in the year. However, Games Workshop plans out their events and releases and such. And so there's going to be Golden Demon at that as well. So you may see a lot of people saving work for one contest or another, and a lot of bouncing back and forth. It will be quite the delight for people who are looking forward to seeing what wins. Because of course, they can't win more than one Golden Demon. So if they bring something and then it wins at Adepticon, they can't bring it then to the event in the United Kingdom and then enter it again. Of course, if it didn't win, they might do that again, but that's not what gets posted to the internet. But so it'll be definitely a font of inspiration for display painters or just people looking to spectate and look at all the gorgeous models. I do miss Crystal Brush a little bit, simply because at Crystal Brush you were able to enter anything, regardless of manufacturer, and now it's up to shows like MFCA or Scale Model Challenge, a lot of the European shows where you'll just see fusion of historical third-party Games Workshop. Almost sometimes Warhammer figures are in the minority there, and I do appreciate that sort of breadth of artistic expression. Not that I dislike Warhammer. More Warhammer is good. I'm just trying to. I wish there was a place for all of those other models that would normally be at Adepticon.
Yeah, I was happy having, subscribed to White Dwarf when I was younger and seeing all the Golden Demon entries. I was happy to see it, but I felt the same way when I saw that it was kind of at the expense of Crystal Brush. That made me a little sad because I wasn't ever able to go. But it is exciting that Golden
Yeah.
Demon is back in the US. And you mentioned all the different stuff that you bring, including Golden Demon entries, including your armies. So, having seen your army painting, it's absolutely spectacular. So, I was curious,
Thank you.
like, how you approach army painting or batch painting versus a display piece, and like hitting that bullseye of an impactful result, but still like efficiency for a large army. How do you approach like those projects
Mm.
differently?
Yeah. So I would say for the most part, I love elves, and I was kind of for the lifespan of Age of Sigmar before Lumineth came about. I was kind of just rendering with my ideas. Like I always wondered, it's like, well, they have to bring back high elves at some point. Like they've done dark elves, they've expanded out dwarves, they've rebooted this faction or this faction. Well, high elves have to be on that list at some point. But before then, like for 2016, 17, 18, 19, like 4 or 5 years, I was like, just kind of, well, what do I want to do? And so sometimes it could be just a single model or a theme I want to express. I would hold up as the paragon my Lumineth army, at least for right now. And what I wanted to do with that was have we all at events emphasize again that artistic expression. I want to not only have an elf army that people appreciate if they're playing against it on the other side of the table, but I want it to be quintessentially mine. I want this to look like no one else's Lumineth army. People should be able to recognize it as, oh, that's Martin's Lumineth army, even from like at a glance. And so I thought about ways in which I could best express myself, how I approach my personal taste in art, things that I might have had disagreements with in terms of how Games Workshop sculpted things. With just as a brief aside, how Lumineth are sort of the spiritual successor to High Elves from Warhammer Fantasy. They are not a direct one-to-one, as one might see with the new Seraphon or maybe the Slaves to Darkness range, where you can clearly tell these are updated versions of those units. They haven't really been um, changed at a core aesthetic level. But that did happen to an extent with Lumineth because they wanted to add in um, a mix of nostalgia, innovation, and reinvention. And where I might have disagreed with that aesthetic, it's like, well, I'm going to change it. I'm going to take some pieces maybe from other kit ranges, or maybe do some very minor sculpting, like changing emblems or removing them, or adding pieces. And uh, that one was it came out right at the beginning of lockdown, and that was at a point in time where we didn't know when we were going back to events, and so I made the decision to be like, well, I get to take my time then. I get to be especially extravagant because I don't know when the next event will be, but that's not going to stop me from making sure that this is the most impressive thing I can make it. And so I just put in extra hours, making all of the details like uh, I would say just unnecessarily pretty is the best way I could describe it. Whether it's getting text like rare paints, stuff that you wouldn't normally use on Warhammer models, and tinkering with like color schemes. Like I had like 5 or 6 different models testing out, just like which of the skin look like, which of the face look like on these troops. How does this textile pair with this armor color? Different samples. A lot of stuff that I wouldn't recommend for people. It's a much simpler way to get from A to B. Because if I were giving advice, so well, how do you pick an army thing? It's like test models. You shouldn't need more than 1 or 2 before you have a good idea of where you're going. That wasn't enough for me because they often spare no expense for some of these models. Requires you buying a bunch of boxes just for faces. Go for it. Uh, it's not necessary all the time. Uh, yeah, and now that I finished the Lumineth, I've been kind of at a loss because I was like, well, the only army I played in fantasy was High Elves, and I don't feel like going back to the other Age of Sigmar armies I own, at least right now. And I was usually when I have most of my like my biggest ideas is when I'm at a tournament, because I'm always impressed by all the creative stuff that people bring, especially now that people are coming back from lockdown. Like they are feeling like their risk tolerance is safe enough so they can come back and they bring like this gorgeous stuff. A good example would be a friend of mine, Oscar Lars. I don't know if you saw on Instagram this week. He's bringing a Black Library themed Haradrim Overlord's army. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen it, but it sounds familiar. I think I follow the Instagram, so I'll have to check. I'll have to search the account.
His flagship, the KO Ironclad, was in a Warhammer Community article last week because it had all of Gotrek's side characters. It has Malinet. Like if for people who've read the Age of Sigmar Gotrek stories, Gotrek has a new posse to replace Felix, and there's like a few others who are on the Ironclad for aesthetic purposes. And you can tell that it's like this is the thing he spent like 2 years on. Even if he didn't do that all the time, because he's a full-time commission painter, you can tell this was his labor of love, and he's going to win a lot of awards for it, rightly so, because it's exceptional. Um, and when I'm at a tournament, and regardless of how well I do at that tournament, whether I win a paint award or I don't, or if I win a bunch of games or I don't, I usually have a lot of ideas churning. So what do I want to do next? Because I always feel like I feel the thing which I tell people they shouldn't be obligated to do, which is escalate my commitment. What do I want to bring next year? What do I want to bring that's like really flashy, really cool? Because it's going to make me feel cool making it, and other people are going to have a better time if they play against it. And so at a tournament in November, like, well, what do I do? I feel like the elves are done right now. I've played over 150 games with this army. I feel like I've gotten as much as I can out of it for right now. So I thought, well, if I don't want to play anything else, I should make my own Warhammer faction. Does that show up well enough on camera?
You can see it a little bit, but definitely make sure you follow Martin's Instagram as well. I have it on the screen to see the nice up close updates that I'm sure are ahead.
And this model, I'm gonna have to finish this and 4 other models tonight after our call. Like they have to be done tonight.
Oh dear. Okay, I
I'm
won't keep
working
you
on
too
a
long then, because
yeah.
I want to see those,
No
so I
problem.
need you to work to finish them.
Yeah, and then even after that is the unit that I have to finish by over the weekend, which is this is not going to show up as well because it's just primed. These are my proxies for Varangard. This is a technically a Slaves to Darkness army. After that tournament in November, I started. It's a 6 hour drive home, or no, 5 hours because I live in North Jersey now, and I was like, well, what do I want to do? And I made the short version is how can I contort my brain and in as many directions as possible to avoid painting and playing bad guy models. And so, because I'm staunchly, it's like I love good guys. Good guys are cool to me, especially ones that are covered in bling, not necessarily a superheroes, which is a very simple costume. And so this is, in short, called the Kingdoms of the Mirrored Edge, which is a Slaves to Darkness. It's almost like it plays as a chaos army, and it's like a freight train. Like they don't have a lot of nuance on the table beyond positioning and when I will charge versus when I will not charge you with axe through face method of combat. It is not subtle, which is a contrast to how Lumineth played, where it's like a lot of hero phase takes 15 minutes. I have a Rolodex of spells and tokens, which I got to divvy out and play very carefully because a lot of my stuff has to save. This is not that. This is tanky paladins, and so instead of champions of chaos, they are meaty paladins that run at you very quickly and deliver righteous vengeance. And you might ask, isn't there an army which already exists like that? It's called Stormcast Eternals. I have about 4,000 points of Stormcast. I'm not really interested in them. I don't want to say anymore. I generally don't sell my armies. Not since I was like very very young. I will come back to them at some point, maybe in a few editions where They have like more robust sub-faction rules and stuff like it, but that's not what I want. They also don't have a lot of troop variety. The Slaves to Darkness book, really one of the most robust army books in the game, for especially for an army which is not subtle in its play style. You have access to tanky foot soldiers, killy paladins or evil paladins, effectively. Big knights, Varangard, big monsters, some of the most terrifying characters in the game, which just are like a hurricane in combat. But also all of these cultist units. Every time they make a new unit for Warcry, it's almost always a chaos unit, and they get added to the Slaves to Darkness army as like themed gladiators or ninjas or something like that. And their abilities in Age of Sigmar are generally utility based, not really meant to get into combat. Like, what are they going to do? Throw daggers and like that's because that's a skirmish. They're meant there for skirmish fighting. But sometimes you add a unit like that. You slice it in at the end for your last like 100 points. They have a neat utility, and they're just fun to add on top of. After painting so many big guys in big armor, you also get to paint these little cultists, which have their own flavor. And I took all of that and said, I'm going to write. I'm going to pretend I'm George R. R. Martin after a fashion. I'm going to write a bunch of lore that most people won't read or shouldn't be expected to read. And that will tell me how my models are going to look. I'll write this whole history and stuff like that. But I have a bunch of rules because I'm also coming at this from the perspective of a TO, where one, you have to abide by WYSIWYG, the golden rule where you can make your models kind of like whatever you want, especially in Age of Sigmar, on the Age of Sigmar side of the fandom. People make up factions all the time, or they'll do like samurai ogres, or they'll do famously Haywo Twitch. I don't know if you watch him at all. He the first time he went to Adepticon, he brought a D&D army where um, like dwarves on bears. It was like elves on dragons. I don't remember the rest. This was like 5 or 6 years ago. But people can just do that. It's not like 40K where you're in it also for the rich lore and you want to express yourself within that big sandbox. Uh, so you have to make sure that all of the models look as they're supposed to in terms of if Chaos Warriors have a sword and a shield, your unit should have a sword and a shield. Chaos Knights, it's a guy on a horse with armor, lance, and a shield, stuff like that. They'll have to be on the same base size, and that tends to restrict you in more ways than you think. And so the best way to look at it, if you're building something like just from scratch, you have to look at the units as archetypes rather than I'm trying to recreate a Chaos Warrior. It's a human with a sword and a shield and heavy armor. You can go in a lot of different directions with that. Um, they also have the whole thing with the chaos marks, and that's minutia, or like that's the small stuff. But I like to think, at least so far, I have succeeded in trying to convey these models appropriately. They can't be confused with each one another in an army.
Yeah, I love that philosophy of looking at them as archetypes because every time I paint an army, I always want to do the thing that's like not in the lore. Like, what's the weird, kooky thing that like no one has seen before? But I still want it to be like appropriate, fit in the setting. So I like
Yeah,
that a lot of like expand, your view of it a little bit of just what is it fundamentally that you're trying to capture, and then like go wild.
every once in a while, I wish Games Workshop would do it more often. They only tend to put up articles like these when they're trying to fill time because they have like whoever works for the community site. Um, I don't remember their name, but they have like a quota where it's like you have to. These are articles that you have to publish, as in these are like the news and like the advertisements. You also have to satisfy a certain amount of I think the term is KPI or whatever it is, where it's like clicks or eyeballs to the site on a weekly basis. And especially when it's dead, like there aren't a lot of products coming out, like say the end of the fiscal year or the holidays, they tend to look usually through Twitter, but also through Instagram for hobbyists of noteworthy talent or collections or something like the Royal Army in Antarctica, where it's like, hey, it's people playing in the South Pole. Let's write an article about that. 1,000 words, stuff like take some pictures. Uh, and there's like fan armies, and there are people who just have the most fantastic and quirky things where they've been left alone in a room for months or years with their own passion, and they just transpose that onto their figures. I'll never forget there was a guy who used to work for Weta Workshop, and now he has a big 3D print thing. I think it was called Hagglethorn Hollow. It was on the MythBusters YouTube channel.
I've seen
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
his name. Yeah, the guy who made Hagglethorn Hollow, he made a gnome army, and it was played as Gits. It was played as night goblins, and instead of having spiders, like because in Gloomspite Gits, you can take the spider goblins, and they have the big arachno orc spider on the big pie plate base. He made like these gigantic contraptions, which had to be like 11 or 12 inches tall, and there's just like one little goblin, and of course it's a Warhammer Night Goblin, like the One Piece ones.
Yeah.
He sculpted on all of them. He sculpted the Keebler elf beard because they're all gnomes. So he sat there, and even though it's a very simple thing to sculpt, I guess if you know what you're doing, because it's just a cone, put some streaks in it for the creases in the hair, and he wasn't particularly focused like on the painting. Like none of them were based. Like a lot of them, it's I guess technically if you want to, it's like, oh, they're not based. It's like this is just how he's expressing himself. They're just like brown base coat bases, but all of this stuff is these wild contraptions and stuff like that. And it's like I love seeing stuff like that, especially if I get to see it at events in person, because then it becomes this immersive experience, almost like an exhibit at a museum, and then you get to talk to the artist and really come through their thought process and just learn so much from all these cool people. I, I'm never intimidated by people who are horrendously more talented than me, because God forbid I should learn something from them.
Yeah, and I appreciate something you said a little bit earlier of like I want to paint something that's going to make me feel cool. And I feel like that removes the stakes for me of like I want to imagine something that it's like, yeah, I painted that. That would be like the coolest thing I can think of, and like paint bravely and experiment until you get there. And you might go down a winding path, but it like, expands your confidence maybe.
Yeah, and sometimes, excuse me, um, there are these cool videos on YouTube where it's almost like uh, not quite like MTV Cribs, but like the more newer fashion of that, where people are showing off like their mansions, or it's like, look at the $60 million apartment, and they talk about how they furnished it with the art. Like we as artists are people who are proud enough to like I think people should take pride in their own artwork in this hobby, because it's one of the things I love the most about it is like you get to buy a model kit. You buy a Games Workshop model kit. Say it's a Space Marine squad. You buy that Space Marine squad, you bring it home. You get to do whatever you want to that model kit. You can make it yours. You can paint if you paint it well enough to be proud of that as artwork, and you put that like on a bookshelf or something. You're filling your home with stuff that you're proud of in terms of art, and you don't have to spend $1 million buying a painting from like some old master at like Sotheby's. You do that if you want. I'm not going to stop anyone, but it's like it's worthwhile, I think, in being able to take pride in your own artwork. And at the same time, of course, it's like a far down the list, but also noteworthy. Uh, and I think that should keep people, at least to a degree, from worrying about how they paint overall. As a quick anecdote, I'm in the Goobertown Hobbies Discord, and the first time I joined that Discord, I said, "Hello, here I am. Here's some of the artwork that I've been working on," and I was working on the Lumineth at the time because it was like 2020, 2021. And it's the stuff I've been working on exceptionally long. You can tell that there's passion put into the artwork. And the number one response that I got from people, aside from, "Oh wow, that's really cool," is like, "You make me want to break my brushes. Why should I put time into this hobby when I can just watch you do it instead?" And I can't really like and when they say compete with that, it's like I don't feel right putting my artwork in the same space as everyone else like that. if you're going to do that. And I wish there was a way to convince people to not have that takeaway because this hobby, the greatest, there's very different. There's so many ways that we can come together as a community in the love of scale models, in the love of Warhammer, the love the game. We can love the lore, but we can also love each other's artwork. It doesn't matter whether they're bad at painting. There's always going to be someone else who spends more time on their work than you. Um, uh, Over the weekend, I taught the first intermediate level class for painting at the Kill Team Open, and one of the first things I said was, "Tabletop quality is a helpful term, but I don't find it to be a useful term
Mm-hmm.
because it implies that tabletop quality has a start and an end, and you have to reach a bare minimum to get to tabletop quality, and anything beyond a certain level is no longer tabletop quality." I don't find either to be true because there are people like me, especially in circles that I've been exposed to. I don't want to say the world over, but they're going to show up to a Warhammer tournament and they're going to have spent many dozens of hours painting models which do not last very long on the table, whether they're regardless of like goblins or chaos warriors or something like that. They don't see play very long. Um, and one might argue, it's like, well, why did you do that when you could have just painted the slap chop or the contrast, or the technical term is underpainting. Uh,
Yeah.
and because of all of that, I don't think it's really self defeating. I think to see people not try. There's someone in the Discord who they love painting their orcs in candy colors, like specifically Willy Wonka candy. They have a troll from Warhammer Underworlds. It's and has a big club. It's holding its club in the ground. And normally, because it's a cave troll, the club is covered in fungus and barnacles or some sort of like growths. And so they were puttied over and painted like nerds rope. So it was a club made of nerds, with little candies and candy rope. And they're going to enter in Golden Demon this year, an Imperial Knight covered in hearts, and like all of these other things. It's like, is it well painted by the standards of someone like spending like 200 hours painting because the Slayer Sword winner last year at Adepticon was little Skink Chief, no bigger than this. They spent about 150 hours painting that Skink Chief. It's blended to the smoothness of like computer generated imaging. Uh, is it as high quality as that? Not necessarily, but that doesn't make it any less someone's art worth sharing and celebrating. Uh, even just finishing an army in general, whether it's uh, I always tell people if they have shaky hands, small children, or just limited time, or if they think that they don't have artistic talent, the whole slap chop method or underpainting is about trying to get this stuff like fighting against the grain, getting it onto the table at a bare bones level with consistent quality. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's an achievement. You spent the time, you spent the weekend, because really you could get this stuff done in a weekend, like a 2,000 point army if you did it that way. It's an achievement to have this thing, and you're going to have it as long as you get enjoyment out of it. It's not going anywhere, at least in our lifetimes. Last 2000 series like that.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying because a lot of times the reason I wanted to start Hamster's Hobby Hang is to encourage people to start painting because we do sell our product, our terrain, uh, factory painted or unpainted. And there's a lot of people that are like, well, I'm not a painter. And it's like, well, why not? It's just because you haven't tried it yet, right? And a lot of it is just taking the time to learn the tools, learn some of the techniques, and going on that journey. And everyone starts somewhere, as they say, and like every part of the journey is valuable and like an impressive feat. And so I just appreciate you
Yeah.
saying that.
And if painting isn't for you, there's probably something else in our hobby which drew you here. Because there was an interesting argument I saw when they announced that Henry Cavill would be partnering with Games Workshop, and they'll probably find an Amazon. I was looking for whatever studio Amazon's going to do it with. for the camera movie or television series through Amazon, and it's going to bring increased exposure to our fandom to the widest possible uh, margin. And the extreme I used was like, it's going to be a little cringy if you hear people like Logan Paul talking about Necrons on their podcast. 'Cause it's going to be new to them. They're going to think it's cool. They're going to like see the and they're probably going to call them toys or something like that. Um, but people who tend to find this hobby, they stick around for one reason or another. Um, like they find something to latch on to. 'Cause there's different things our hobby offers for different people. If they're not into painting, because you don't have to be into painting. My mother tried it. My mother is not a stranger to fandom. She has been helping manage science fiction and fantasy conventions since the late '70s, since there was one Star Wars movie. It was just called The Star Wars. And she tried painting when Star Wars Legion came out. She's like, you know what? I'm finally going to give this a try. She tried painting a few troops. She tried painting a vehicle. I was there helping supervise her. She went to a game store. She tried it. It's like, you know what? I don't really get the hang of painting. It's just not for me. It's like, that's totally okay. I do like the gaming. I do like just hanging out and talking with people. And it's Star Wars, so it's like not like you need to really learn lore as much as some of these other games. And I really encourage people to, even if they don't like painting, to find their niche because there is something out there for you. Warhammer, as we enjoy it, has this robust lore, and there are so many channels just dedicated on social media, like YouTube, just dedicated to talking about the stories, making up your own stories. There's like these different ways to play. Or I keep bringing up Warhammer because that's predominantly what I play, but there's so much like out there. Marvel Crisis Protocol, even like just like tabletop role playing games. How many people do we know that are like celebrities buy Warhammer figures and they end up in D&D and such like that. I'm sure we've all seen the famous Joe Manganiello video. It's not even a man cave anymore. It's like the man palace, and he has like the heads of like different props from like Lord of the Rings and other movies like mounted on the wall. And of course, in the video above the glass cabinets, you can see Nagash and Archeon clearly converted to be something else for D&D. Did they make it? No, they probably paid a nice guy or person. I'm sorry, quite a bit of money to make that model. Uh, but it's still all the same. Like it's just enjoying the camaraderie of building, painting, and playing. And yeah, I what's the word I'm looking for? It's like there's no wrong answer to what you enjoy in this hobby.
Yeah, I like that a lot, especially as, I am super excited that there's people in the office excited about learning war games, and sometimes we throw some skirmish games together. We've played some Frostgrave, we played some Relic Blade, and I'm just like, but you haven't even like touched, it's just the tip of the iceberg here, because I can't explain to you the journey of like finding the model that speaks to you, getting the kit, putting it together, painting it, and you have that time and history with it, and then seeing it on the tabletop, it's like you already won. There's like all aspects of this journey that like are encapsulated in the hobby that are like all part of it.
Somewhere as I over the past summer I moved up closer to New York City. I did have a Frostgrave warband idea around here somewhere, but I can understand the difference between most of those models are dark sword miniatures, and they're generally like one piece, like D&D style, like single cast, either pewter or resin models, but mostly pewter because they're older. I can see the added joy of like all these little parts that you get to customize, especially like in Warcry. So many of the Warcry warbands now, because of how Games Workshop cuts their model kits, you get very dynamically posed models. Also, you'll see almost like a branching skill tree in the instruction manual. Build two of these. You can now build this as this weapon and this weapon, or you can build it with this pose and have this weapon instead. And they have like different rules within the skirmish game. If it's your first kit, probably not too interested in the differences between those very minute math changes and what their stats are on the table. And so it can be quite rewarding to be like, oh, I personalize this guy by making him have the flail, and I gave him the spear and the knife, something like that. And I do really like the Warcry. No, Warcry isn't as robust as Kill Team. I haven't really looked at the rules for Kill Team. I've just been so close to it by osmosis. I know how it's kind of structured compared to Warcry. Warcry at least gives you the freedom. You can really mix and match individual models in your warband, and this idea that everything that that model does is located on one the size of a playing card. The stats they're like about this big. And yes, they're little icons, and you have to refer to someplace else to know what those icons mean. The fact that all of your rules for this one, like fighter, is like on this card, and then I can go through the entire miniatures range. Say, well, if I'm playing a Death Army, because one of the pieces I'm entering at an unrelated painting contest that I've been working on over last year is like a Vampire Vikings warband. So it's like a Vampire Lord. It is a Banshee. It has some thralls. It has some skeleton champions, and like vampire lady on horseback, and stuff gets to mix and match. You really can go nuts, almost like picking and choosing a D&D party. And I really like that over, say, something like Kill Team, which is more squad slot based. You're playing the Space Marine Intercessor Kill Team. You're playing the Death Corps Creed Kill Team, etc.
Yeah, I mean, those of you that have been following Dwarven Forge for a while, you've probably seen some Warcry show up in a photo here and there, but I need to get some dice rolling behind them as well. So you go to a lot of tournaments, you play in them, you are also a tournament organizer. We're running a terrain Kickstarter. What, as a
Mm-hmm.
player, when you get your matchups, you've traveled with your army, you see a battlefield, what are the most important things that you're looking for, like within the terrain? What are some things that you're happy to see? What are some pitfalls in as far as strategy, when you're looking at the battlefield itself when it's all built out? How I'm just I've been trying to get Dwarven Forge into the minds of wargamers. So I'm really curious, like what you look at as a strategic player and a successful one at that. How do you look at the terrain as part of your strategy?
So I will add a preface to this as something specifically for tournament organizers. I'd like it to be durable. I would like it to be able to be stored easily. Stacking isn't necessarily always possible, but if it can stack, that is appreciated because I need to be able to put it into bins. I need to be able to put it into a storage unit for most of the year. And so sometimes, like if it's uh, uh, like a good, have you ever seen the ziggurats? They look like they're square. The Age of Sigmar Forbidden Power. They look like they come like a 30-degree angle, and then they have a flat top, hollow underneath, so
Yeah,
they can
yeah.
be stacked. So usually, it's not necessarily possible all the time, but something like that, if it's like the same piece and then hollow underneath, so it can be stacked, it's usually helpful. Again, that's usually not possible, but if it's durable enough to be placed into a container, that container can be filled with enough of it with packing material as well. We really appreciate if we can fit more terrain for more tables and fewer bins, because those bins have to live somewhere. And I do have a storage unit. Most TOs probably end up with a storage unit at some point, and so that's generally helpful. On the Age of Sigmar, on the tournament organizer and tournament player side, sometimes there are layouts. There is definitely a movement on the 40K side for sure, but on the Age of Sigmar side, depending on who you talk to, there is a standardized layout sort of camp between like 6 and 8 pieces of terrain. Two of them should be this. Two of them should be this. Two of them should be this. We like a pair of obstructing, like the bottom floor should always block line of sight. Even though Age of Sigmar is a mostly melee focused game, we do like our obscuring, impassable, charge blocking terrain, preferably towards the center of the table. I would like it to have area terrain, as in it's not a collection of loose pieces. One of the things that I understand for skirmish level and role playing game style terrain is that it's more conducive to having scatter or clutter which is pieces like treasure chests and barrels and stuff that you would just find like as like props strewn about in a small area. But there's no beginning or end to where that area is, other than drawing like a rough square or shape at a foundation. And this is a clear demarcation of where the terrain ends, where the terrain begins, in a self-contained or continuous fashion. That would be appreciated. So if you show off like lots of area terrain in, I would prefer it to like be like at least a little prettied up, like it can have like slopes at the edges, not like sometimes especially in 40K, it's like here's the edge of the building, open ground, terrain, and that can look a little artificial at times, especially now that we've moved away from plywood boards and hills to the neoprene mats, which you've usually seen at events or even game stores. It's a great invention. It just means that the playing surface is a little less visually interesting. So if the terrain can have a little bit of prettied up edge to like where the terrain ends, that would be cool. And Age of Sigmar doesn't need too much stratification. So I understand like why I'm describing it to you first as like an organizer, but like
Yeah.
as a player, I don't want to lose the thread too much. Uh, it's like yes, a clear demarcation of where the terrain ends, some line of sight blocking at the base of it, almost universally. If you make forests, make sure the forests are the trees can be removed at some point because I don't know if you've ever seen Games Workshop's classic forests. That they're very hard to like actually put models in. They've changed it since then, but like just make sure it's easy to move the models through. But this combination of obscuring, line of sight blocking, and it doesn't have to be too tall. It can be like 1 or 2 levels in terms of, but like there we don't really need sniping from like the third floor of a ruined tower or something like that. We don't really have those types of units in Age of Sigmar. Uh, does that sufficiently answer your question? I understood. I rambled a lot there.
No, no, I appreciate all of it. I'm listening intently. Um, and listen, I know I work there, but genuinely, there's so many cool factors about Dwarven Forge that like hit the TO bullseye, I think, because um for one thing, when we did forests, which have the removable trees, it's a peg system where it's basically a stump, and then you can put the different canopies as stack them as much as you want with the peg system. But then one of the most popular items from that Kickstarter was nice sculpted banks, because the floor is a square, and a lot of times in a D&D encounter it's built out kind of to a border, kind of like the edge of a grid map or something. But for what I pictured them on was one of these neoprene battle mats, and so we have these beautiful sculpted banks to put around the edges that like completely clean up that edge and look beautiful and sort of neat
Yeah.
when it's going down to table level. And I'll tell you what, I met you briefly at Adepticon last year. The big display build that we had, we built that out. We dumped it into a suitcase and checked it on the airplane and put it out that way. So this stuff, I mean, we say it's indestructible. It really is nearly indestructible. Like it's awesome stuff. So
Right.
especially since you're
Nice.
in the area, um, if you're setting up events and stuff, I would love to talk about getting you some of these forests or something.
Yeah, I'll definitely keep in touch with you on stuff like
Yeah,
that. Yeah, good to know.
yeah.
Uh,
And I was curious as well. You mentioned that you did a painting class recently. And I think, was this one of your first times doing that, or have you taught before?
only at an intermediate level. I'm used to being asked to, especially at I would say like other events and shows that I volunteer at, to run beginner classes where it's like this is the difference between a Games Workshop paint and a Vallejo paint. You can mix them; they won't explode or something. Here's how to hold a paintbrush. Here's how to apply it um, uh, thinly. This is what it means to thin paint. Stuff like that. This was the first time I was allowed to let loose, and I don't feel comfortable necessarily doing masterclass things where like it's 4 or 5 hours and I'm talking you through how to paint a model. Maybe in a few years when I've painted more display models just like back to back instead of once in a blue moon. But this one, I felt very comfortable going through it. It was nice. It's a lot of the stuff I tell people all the time. It's just now that they were paying to be there and they were like suckers. I'm joking, of course.
Right, right.
Uh, it was like a I taught people were very straightforward. Like I didn't really use any techniques which were beyond the pale of someone who's been around miniature painting for a while. We used some layering, some very simple glazes. It was a lot about how to implement different aspects of color theory at the same time. Because especially in some of my better armies, in terms of armies that have won more rewards, they tend to use and this is just something I would say that's universally true. This is not my key to success. This is a very universal concept of maximizing how much color theory you use on your models to make them as dynamic as possible, which means that you have to include different types of contrast. You have to really you have to weaponize color theory to just make the eye just like dazzle it. It turns a regular elf spearman, for example, into something truly one of a kind and fantastic. And so I had people pull up color wheel on their phone. It's like, well, if you go here for your shadow, and then you go here to maximize saturation, and we're doing all of those things. And the clickbait title of the class was "How to Paint Black and White Without Using Black or White," and that's basically what we did. It didn't. We were given 3.5 hours because that was the time slot, but we did, it was done in like 2 hours in terms of like how much like I give people horse heads or stag heads, like a deer to paint, and I gave everyone the same paints. And here are some cold grays, here are some warm browns and near whites. So it was like black hair and black fur, and white hair and white fur on like the same model, and it was showing people some simple concepts which cannot be applied to every color in the spectrum on your game, especially on your gaming models, because this is has an exponentially more significant effect on gaming miniatures rather than display models. Because I think on display models, they're already taking into account mood and general, more of a painter, like a portrait sort of composition, rather than thinking of a whole army, a whole gaming army, which is this three-dimensional, expansive thing as your canvas. And so I was taking people through is how I painted this horse. You're now all going to paint it like this. And as we're going, I'm teaching people why we're using certain colors. Why are we shading white with red? Why are we shading black with red? Like that, just as a broad example. I was like, well, here's why. A little bit of visual aids to walk people through it on the Twitch stream, maybe another time. But I do think it went over well. I would be comfortable teaching something like that again. If people want to reach out to me on Instagram if they have these questions, because some people who couldn't make it to the class, it's like, do you teach regularly? And it's just like, ask me whenever. Here are the recipes. Here's the paints we used. Go for it. Try it this way. Take a picture of it, and then I'll just tell you how I would make some changes or whatnot. And like, I just draw, I edit it on my phone with my finger, just like put some more highlights here, clean this up, stuff like that. Um, it's hardly magic. It's just more that people might not necessarily be used to thinking with such an emphasis on color theory in how they paint their models. And that's what the class was about.
That's awesome. I might have to take you up on the DMs being open because I am super interested in color theory, and I learned a lot just from what you're saying about like, oh, I should think of it that way and apply it that way, especially in the realm of army versus display, of like what are the important factors. Like you're already trying to learn color theory, which gets pretty complex. It can be simple but also can be complex, but it's like, so but then up in the context of painting small gaming models, like what are the most important things to implement. that are going to be the most impactful. And I always
A
kind of,
lot of
yeah, go ahead.
a lot of these tools, because they're more knowledge-based tools rather than skill-based tools. Because people who are used to using maybe contrast paints or something like they're not really used to doing detail work. When I offer, especially, I try and put some of these like on a rudimentary level into the beginner courses as well. Where it's like, um, if people come into the hobby, if they're brand new, because everyone starts somewhere, and this is someone. Sometimes it's someone's first hobby product. They get the free Space Marine when they walk into a Games Workshop, and they buy a contrast paint, and they get a brush from like Michaels or Blix, and they put the contrast paint on there. It's like that's doing a lot. That's seeping into all the details, and it's tinting the model blue or something like that, just for like an ultramarine. And then generally, when they get more into the hobby at a very beginner level, they're taught the Games Workshop method of base coat, wash, layer, highlight. It's not a fault. It's selling someone 4 paints. It's a very straightforward way of getting the models to look as they do on the tabletop in all of the instruction booklets and such. And but it can teach people to paint in a way which does not necessarily take into account color theory, um, where I say that as in like color theory is always being done by the designers. Like the Ultramarine scheme already has color theory implemented, but um, people don't think about how they can use colors to make these textures more visually interesting without having to pull out that micrometer 00 brush that like has like 3 hairs on it. So like if you shade your ultramarines with by mixing some red into your blue paint and then glazing that into the shadows, just a little bit of and stuff on your big brush that you got from Blix.
Right.
Or if you put a little bit of green paint in your red when you're painting a cape, and if you put that green mixed with the red into the folds and such, instead of just using Nuln Oil, it changes the way it looks, and it's more dynamic. It looks like your eye is picking up on that added saturation in a way which is just it took just as little time as the Nuln Oil did, but it's already just a little bit better. It's a little bit you're not putting in extra time. You don't have to learn anything new other than just having a little wheel with colors on it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you did a class on black and white, especially because, you threw in that theory of like it's not just other colors, but it's interesting how like those two are so deceptively difficult to paint because starting out intuitively you're like, oh, I'm going to paint it with my black paint, paint it with my white paint, but it gets really flat real fast and you lose some of the depth and all like the highlights and the shadows of like how light interacts with those colors. So like I think that's really cool that you started with that subject because it's it's a deep rabbit
To
hole.
remember, and it's important to remember that there are multiple ways to paint black and white. And when I said how to paint black and white without using those two colors, obviously certain temperatures, like you can't. This was a very cold black, a very warm white. You can't really paint a cold white, which requires a lot of blues and such, without getting more of that white paint involved. And, not only is temperature play a role in getting away with these effects, so color is our eyes see color also by association. As a simple example, my hand looks white next to this black T-shirt, but this T-shirt is not a true black, and my hand is not a true white. Most like this Caucasian skin is actually quite like a peach color, and this is probably closer to like a dark green because this is what we do in the shadows shirt, and everything that from that is like a little neon tinted, for example. And but that's just an example of I have the model here. It's not going to show up very well because this is a low light. I'm using a laptop computer. You can see that enough. Like this was the model I painted for the demo class. You can see I painted it up to a white and a black sort of down here. Can you see that all right? Enough?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And And because of those associations, the warm browns like and the pale grays next to a cold black of the snout, which doesn't really have any black in it at all. It's mostly Games Workshop's Dark Reaper and Thunderhawk Blue. These are close to black, but when you look at them, when you look at the paint pot, it's like, oh, this is a very dark turquoise, which is a nice color. But we're using those to represent a color which is different from itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Some
yeah.
of this does require visual aids like that, and it's like people are like, "Huh?" And then we start painting it, and then the students start to understand the finished product of um, taking otherwise uninteresting colors and making them more interesting by simply changing their saturation, temperature, where they are on the model associated to one another. And then possibilities open up even further because that was just how to paint the steed. Usually a model is riding that, and then you can do all sorts of things with the model riding the steed, and then those colors from the rider and the steed play off of each other and create a much more robust palette. Opens up so many possibilities, and I think that's how some award-winning armies at these events truly shine. Just execution of technique, but how they use color. And I think if you are able to weaponize color, for lack of a better term, to make your models all the more uh, appealing to the eye, I think that that's a worthwhile pursuit.
Yeah, and that made me think of a question because I know you've done some kind of like bust painting and the display painting and that kind of thing. So how this is something I've been trying to tackle, and I know the answer is also just practice painting larger scales. But like, how do these rules of thumb change when you're going to like a larger scale, like a bust or a 75 mil? Like, because you can get away with exaggeration, and in
Uh,
fact, it's helpful at the small scale, right? But then how do you like graduate to that larger scale?
the first thing that I think, regardless of larger scale, is going from a gaming army to a display piece where you're no longer painting a whole. You're no longer creating a world. You're no longer doing it's like, well, I have these characters and infantry and vehicles and monsters and skirmishers and maybe even a diorama board fully express myself. You are now focused on a singular piece of artwork, whether it's a golden demon for like a one space space marine, but a single dark elf on like a hill versus a large scale like witch or a bust of like a knight or a historical subject like a 17th century conquistador or something like that. And you have to think about beforehand the composition that you're looking for. The singular model that you're working on has to have a mood, more or less, because you're no longer you're painting one picture. You're almost like you're taking a photograph, and that it requires a little bit of planning ahead of time in a way that's different from army painting. And so you have to think about your light source. Um, Light sources are so critically important when you're looking at these larger scale or singular pieces in general, because you're expected to, at least at a competition level, even though you could just always paint for yourself, but if you're painting this for competition, you have to constantly think about where your light is coming from because you're no longer painting a miniature. You're painting light. You're painting how light is impacting the scene that you're creating. And that's extraordinarily difficult without doing your research on how light will work on these textures. Non-metallic metal did not start as a miniature wargaming technique. Non-metallic metal has been around for a long time, probably called something else, where it's like even before metallic acrylic paints. Um, all of these Renaissance portraits from the old masters technically use non-metallic metal because that's not metal paint that King Louis the 16th is wearing. He's that breast paint is painted with matte oil paints. The armor reflection has to be painted that way. Not saying that you have to use matte paint all of the time. In fact, I don't like using that. I prefer true metallic metals 100%. Um, you should find the thing that works best for you. And so, I guess to summarize, think about your light placement, think about the mood you want to convey, and from those two core ideas will come the palette that you eventually reach. Because even if a model, say like a high elf wizard, high elf wizard has like set colors, like from Total War Warhammer, it's like white, silver, gold, blue, black, etc. Those colors may change because, like, well, what if it's a high elf wizard in a cave, at the base of a volcano, dueling an orc guy, and like so, if they're in the volcano, like all of that red light is going to change all of the colors you're going to use, and so it may end up some of our favorite Golden Demon models can be like a Darren Latham. Have you heard of Darren Latham?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Darren Latham, the head of the Citadel Miniatures team, he often does Golden Demon in a very classical way. He takes the miniature, he paints it. Sometimes that wins awards. Like I believe last year he won bronze at Warhammer Fest for the leagues of Votan, Captain Carl or something like that. It's a Space Dwarf hero. Like he painted it. That's it. I think more um, as you get into more robust competitions beyond Golden Demon, where composition is much more heavily weighted, or that's what they're looking for. You get stuff where the palette will change based on the environment that you're depicting. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like again, I'm not trying to bash the model. I'm saying it's like some people think that Golden Demon is just that. You have to take the model, you have to paint it. That's universally not true.
Right, right.
You should feel free if you want to just paint the model to a perfect pristine level. More often than not, I think it's more appropriate to try and give it a mood.
Yeah, as I've delved into like, going from that level of just like painting miniatures for my army and going from kind of coloring book mode to like how to give it that story, basically turn it into storytelling. My favorite thing to paint now is light. If it's OSL, if it's reflections of some kind or whatever, really, that's when super fun to dive into. I know you said uh you came from Warhammer Fantasy playing High Elves. Where I started, I played dwarves in Warhammer Fantasy, so I found the right place to work. But
Mhm.
I was curious, since you said you had that history with it, how did you feel when they said the old world is gone? We're going to Age of Sigmar. I see now you've embraced this new aesthetic and this new setting, and do great things with
Yeah.
it. But what was that like when that happened for you?
Uh, mm, I have a complicated relationship with that because, especially in the South, I grew up in South Jersey and the Greater Philadelphia area, and that region of the U.S. Was one of the last holdouts for Warhammer Fantasy. Like even from like 2010 to 2014, it was clear that the game was like on a slow decline, um, and because of the various sins and mistakes that led to the collapse of the game's profitability for Games Workshop. But no matter what, there was one of the last large Games Workshops in like the United States was in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and once a month, the store manager was able to get people from all over, like from Maine to Virginia. They would come for like one day events, and they would play inside the Games Workshop. They would play Warhammer Fantasy. Robust, it was a competitive atmosphere, um, but nearly all of them did not take the demise of Warhammer Fantasy particularly well, and that toxicity pervaded for some years. I think more or less everyone's like moved on. There are a few people who haven't. I don't understand why. It's been about 8 years now, almost. It's but and so no matter what, my local gaming group, even though I was able to travel all over the United States, especially in the Midwest, became like the TOs for Adepticon, which was like the first big, like massive event for AOS in the US. A lot of those guys like jumped on right away. Uh, so for me, it was always sad because it's like a lot of those people were my friends, and it's a shame to see them like hold on to bitterness to such an extent where it's like not only did they refuse, it's like, well, I'm looking for games. It's like, well, we can always play fantasy. Well, I want to play this game, and this is like, no, I refuse, and I question your character for enjoying that game. It's like,
Right.
why do you have such a strong mentality? It's like it's just a board game. And I did I only got into fantasy right after 8th edition came out, and while I appreciate elves, it was clear that they didn't have as much central planning towards the lore of the game in general as they do now. And so, like the stuff I loved about High Elves, stuff I loved about High Elves was true years before I got into the game, and didn't change until like even after the old world blew up. Like Tyrion and Teclis were always around. It's like those characters never really did anything interesting for me to really fall in love with them to a point where I'm sad that universe died. If that makes sense, it's like that. It's always there. Like even though technically it's over, it's like your favorite video, the fictional. Imagine the fictional universe your favorite video game, and your favorite video game is done. Like I don't care if it's Dragon Age or something like that. Like I just comes to mind because I love Dragon Age, but it's like pretend there are no more video games. Like it's been done. It's been done for over a decade or more. It's like do you lament that there are no more games for that? Or it's like no, you enjoyed the time you had with it. It doesn't change. Lord of the Rings movies are a good example. It's like Rivendell and all that stuff isn't going anywhere. You can enjoy it for the rest of your life. Like that stuff's still there. Um, and I'm looking forward to the newer old world, even though I know they're not going to make much stuff for my specific faction. I think it's mostly going to be focused on the stuff they've advertised, which is the Empire Civil War, the stuff specifically focused in that part of the old world. Never really did enough interesting things with the lore or the story of the High Elves that really made me like. It's a shame. If I had more time, I would be going to how I was critical. It's like I don't know if they needed to blow up all of the old world. I think it would have been cooler because at the very beginning of Age of Sigmar, which was a shaky launch for those unaware, the main thing that they added to the setting, the fantasy setting, were stargates. They added they're now called realm gates, but they added the same mechanic as found in the Stargate universe. There are these portals which connect between each other, and it allows for the universe to be much larger in scope, and for these fantasy armies which have medieval equivalent technology of as in they can't get in cars, they can't get in aircraft, they have to basically walk everywhere. But because they have these portals, they're allowed to jump between sections of the galaxy map, as it were, to fight each other and fight for domination. I think they could have like maybe broken it up into more continents or whatever, like made it like what's it called, Plankscape or something like that, or something like that, and kept the a lot of the history because I think that's a lot what a lot of people were um, appreciative of, especially in 40k. People love the history of 40k. A lot of stuff doesn't need to happen in the present of 40k for people to be as interested in this rich. Like I can look at a thing and know that it has this bestiary of knowledge and stuff, which informs the context of why my goofy Imperial Guard are fighting the goofy orcs, as it were. All of that stuff has some sort of narrative weight to it of history. Age of Sigmar doesn't quite have yet. It's getting there, but it's clearly in a stage still of. If you remember the scene from Wallace and Gromit, where they're laying the train tracks out in front of them while the train is speeding by,
Right,
people are
right.
asking for more. People are asking for more depth on the cities of Sigmar, or what is Sigmar doing right now? And it's like we still have to do Dark Elves. We still have to do Wood Elves. We still have to do probably one more Death Army. We still have to probably do another Destruction Army. Like we're still building out horizontally, and it's very, very clear. There are nebulous time skips within the Age of Sigmar setting, which some people aren't appreciative of. And the fantasy fans are like, well, I remember when there was a calendar. I remember where it's like there were you You could go through periods of time and understand the context and the weight of all of the decisions that are being made within this grimdark universe. Yeah, that's in Age of Sigmar too. I don't have to explain to you. I don't want to put on the accent. There need not be said that this is a Games Workshop setting, and so it is a comically grimdark setting to try and masquerade this very family-friendly game of putting toy soldiers down on a plastic board and rolling dice, and some of them fall over after you roll dice. Um, these so the roundabout way to answer your question, I don't I miss certain things about fantasy, but I don't necessarily miss the restricted place I think Warhammer Fantasy ended up, where they didn't really know what to do with a lot of the plot and characters.
Right, right. And you mentioned the launch of Age of Sigmar, and please correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but what what did you think? Like, because the idea when it first launched was like, our rules are going to be a little less complex. It's going to be like a 4-page booklet,
Mhm.
right? That was like the philosophy. And then, it was a little rocky and it has since evolved into kind of this complex
Mhm.
thing with all the stuff going on that we know and love oftentimes with Warhammer. Were you in the game like at that launch and like through that progression? And like, what did you think as it was like feeling out its
Yeah.
identity?
So I'm going to shout out. There was an episode on Chris Peach's podcast, The Painting Phase, which is also on YouTube. It's the episode this week. He had a games designer who was with Games Workshop during the formative years of Age of Sigmar, though he worked on specialist games like Titanicus. And named James Hewitt. There's a remarkable testimonial about the insider perspective during those days. Uh, and I do believe them when they say that the pivot towards 4 pages of rules was um, because of this ramping up of complexity across board games, like just board gaming in general and D&D. There is a push. There's a refreshing perspective of like just keep it simple. There's what's it called? One-page rules. One-page rules is like dominating like the indie scene right now, where you can like have entire wargaming factions fit like on one page of just like everything you need to know how to play this entire faction right here. Workshop at the beginning had this idea of like we're just gonna have it on 4 pages. Um, I think the proper prescription is I think BattleTech does this. You have the core rules, which are the 4 pages. Optional rules, which are for like narrative stuff, and then you have the tournament rules, which is its own publication basically. And so you have the thing that you can hook customers on, which is the in the Age of Sigmar's case, the 4 pages of rules. They can on their own go through that journey of all right, this is too simple. I would like to enjoy this in a more mentally engaging way. Here's the complex rules. I'm going to pick that up. And then all of a sudden they're playing the proper way, even though there's no proper way, the more satisfying way to engage with the game. I think Age of Sigmar's problem was is that, and this was also at a time where they were transitioning the CEO from Kirby to Roundtree, though I'm not entirely aware of the whole politics and stuff, the intra-company thing that's best asked to a Games Workshop employee. I do know that a lot of big decisions were made at that time as the very top was changing hands, and I think they thought that well we can put out the 4 pages of rules, the basic rules, and people are going to hook pitch onto that. For a while it did, but most of their existing customer base said that this is not enough. There is no point system. There's no system for which we can build armies in a fair way for pickup games. I do think that there was a little bit of a lot of internal play testing is done at Warhammer World, which makes sense. It's the gaming hall above the office where a lot of the rules are written, and so it makes sense that sometimes the at least at the time this is years and years ago now. that they're in a very casual sense. It's like, well, I'm going to take a character and 2 units and I'm going to put them on the table, and you can put a character and 2 units and put them on the table. That seems about fair. I think that's where the power level for 40k came from. And then put on the data card a much more self-contained way of valuing these units, where we're not going to make you pay for war gear, uh, and special systems are optional. You can either say they have them or they don't, and that was just not enough for people. Also, at the same time, there was a series of hardcover books put out called the Realm Gate Wars, which followed the meaty end times things, which was the chronicle of the death of the old world. And so right after that, and like from the end of like 2015 through like the beginning of 2016, with relative rapid fire, these big meaty $60 to $80 books, which were just like very rushly put together campaign books. They had a lot of lore, but they were just like the lore about Stormcast Eternal battles. They were like Space Marine battles, but like don't know who these set. This is a brand new setting. Don't really have pathos with any of these characters. You can clearly tell a lot of the art was rushly, like I don't want to say rushed, but like you could tell it's like we need freelancers. We need more art to fill these pages, because a lot of them are like 150, 200 pages. Like that's a hardcover book. So they needed to like fill it with brand new art. They could not use a lot of the art from Warhammer Fantasy because Stormcast didn't exist, Fire Slayers didn't exist. Um, yeah, they had to do Sylvaneth, all of the Treekin without Wood Elves because there's still not really a proper Wood Elf faction in the game yet.
Hmm.
And fighting bad guys, which included all of these new Khorne models, which did not have art yet. So just building everything from square zero. Even though they had so much lead time, it was clear that they were trying to launch the game with perhaps too much. Which it's a series of difficult choices, and it showed that they couldn't really find the footing until I think the summer of 2016, when the very first General's Handbook was published, with the help of the community. There's even pictures in there of them like at like bigger independent tournaments, and a lot of people who ran independent tournaments in the UK and the US became part of like the initial play testers, which fed their own data into what points should be, and the first matched play scenarios that led to a cohesive, competitive version of the game. Uh, and I think the rest is history. It has gone on to be quite successful. It is the fastest growing game that Games Workshop has ever created. Like 40k is growing, yes. Like it is, it's always going to be like the big cash cow. But like the idea that we can go from like 40 players to like 280 in like 4 years at LVO shows you that there is a very large demand for playing this game. And I do think we've gotten to the point now in the third edition of the game where it could do with a bifurcation of its rule set, where you have a simple and a tournament version of these rules. Because I think we're getting back to that top heavy. It's not as bad as 40k. You can tell it's like there's some holes at the seams, which could be like best. Like let's just try and parse this a little bit better.
Yeah, it's I was kind of chatting with you earlier where like in the around the birth of Age of Sigmar and even now, I've always followed it. I just like haven't had the miniatures and, as you said, the space in New York City to like have a large collection as I wanted, so I haven't really been able to sit down and play the games, but it's been really interesting to like see it evolve, and as it grows deeper, like how it still forms its separate identity from 40k. Because when they tried the 4-page thing and they're like, well, we're going to add more, I was like, okay, it's going to be 40k fantasy, and then it's not. There's things unique in it, which is like really cool to see.
Uh, yeah, I again, I've only played one game of 40k, but as like Games Workshop fan, and I attend a lot of these conventions. They explain a lot of you learn a lot about these games through osmosis if you're paying attention. Like even at the seminars where like they're doing the previews and saying 40k is going to do this, we're changing from this to this, and you can relatively understand what they're talking about. As just an example for any 40K fans in the chat, you got command points from us. We fixed formations. They gave us formations, and we fixed them. Uh, and you took battle tactics and gave them like like the whole thing about stratagems. Like there's a lot of borrowing back and forth been done in its own way. Unfortunately, that tends to lead to them messing up in unique ways, but it's par for the course. Like there are few game companies that put out the volume of product that Games Workshop does. So it's remarkable that they're able to at least have a baseline level of quality control in their publications with the breakneck pace that they engage in. And for small teams too, they really need to hire more people. And if one is on social media, you'll see the listings from Games Workshop. It's like we're hiring in UK, Nottingham local. Like we're looking for editors, we're looking for background writers, we're looking for this and that. Yes, that hiring process takes years, literal years, but it's a sign that they are generally creating the product that you love with not enough staff, and that the fact that they're able to do all of this is a testament to their dedication, like all of the employees' dedication.
Yeah,
Of course, things do be.
yeah, it's been kind of wild to see like the schedule ramp up and up and up with army releases and book releases, and the specialist games are getting love. Like sometimes they'll sort of disappear and then come back into the forefront, and now we're seeing like Horus Heresy. I hope the old world. I'm kind of wondering what the schedule for the people internally working on it, like what the schedule looks like for the old world, because it's mostly concept art we've seen over a number of years. But it's really cool to see them,
Yeah,
like, they have their
I can't.
flagship things, but
Yeah, at least from my understanding is that the team at least at the in my, like again from my learning through osmosis, I don't actually know anyone like on the games where like the only person I know personally that worked on Old World is Louise Sugden. Again, I've only met her at conventions and stuff, and she now works for the community team. So it's like I don't really know anyone there, but like generally the specialist games they have their teams are very small. Like maybe 10 to 12 people. They could be more, could be less, depending. Like I'm sure 30K has more people on it, but like Lord of the Rings is maintained by like only a handful of people, and they do a wonderful job with that game. But they also don't have to like let's make a new plastic kit and stuff like that. They don't have those resources, which is generally why you see characters sculpted in 2022, and they're surrounded by models which were sculpted in 2004,
yeah.
stuff like that. But that's Lord of the Rings. I do know that Horus Heresy is like made a tremendous amount of money for them, and so they're probably going to keep pouring more consistent amounts of money in there. It will be different, I think, now that the books are done. Like the last few novels, like the Siege of Terra series, is coming out. So maybe now, like it's probably too many variables for me to speculate on Horus Heresy, but for Old World, I'm really surprised that they did 28 millimeter.
Hmm.
I thought it would be the perfect opportunity, especially for these small scale development teams, go to something like a 15 millimeter scale game and bring back because they love their nostalgia. And it's like we're going to bring back Titanicus, we're going to bring back Aeronautica Imperialis, we're going to bring back, and this should have been like War Master or Epic. And when you're working with such a small team and your products tend to be self-contained, it's like, well, you have enough to play in one box. If it was a 15 millimeter game, you could stick like half an army or like a full army even $1, and it would come with enough sprues for like a character on dragon, like with how the modern model kits are now. Like you could have like a unit take up this much space on a table, and you can better balance and release more product for more armies that way. You don't have to worry about cross compatibility with Age of Sigmar or other game systems. Yes, you don't get to use your older models anymore. I think that's what they wanted. They wanted to make sure it's like we want all of the old world like people with their old fantasy models can still use them. It's like maybe you could work in a way that the scale is appropriate. Like if you put out a unit of 10 25 mil bases, that counts as like 250 models in like a unit or something like that. You could do a conversion sort of thing, but I'm not the game designer. I don't get to make the decisions. But because they are doing the 28 millimeter, and how I think uses common sense on how Forge World works. The kits most of the time they put out resin, or they put out resin augmentation sprues or packaging to go onto a universal plastic model. And so they keep talking about all of these updates for different armies, but I think they're only going to make new models based on stuff which is unique to their range. So stuff like Kislev, stuff like the Total War factions that are being developed, like new art and everything, specifically for Total War. Like I think Cathay, Kislev, and if there's more factions which are unique to those games, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but other Empire factions and maybe Britonia, they will get resin sculpts. They will be able to be played. I'm sorry, you'll be able to buy those as new models and then use your old ones. They release old stuff. I'm not sure. I don't know if those molds still exist anymore. Surely they can't for things like as in Age of Sigmar, we've seen a lot of like Seraphon, Slaves to Darkness, um, a little bit of ogres, definitely Iron Jaws, which is like all the Black Orcs and stuff like that, and Moon Clan Goblin, like Moon Clan and stuff like the Git side of Orcs and Goblins. Those all have newer plastic versions of older models. So I don't know what happens to those molds when they go away. I don't think anyone does that isn't part of the company. But like, so Chaos Warriors used to be rank and file. They had the sword, they had the hand weapon, and you could either do this with a halberd or a sword or something like that. Chaos Warriors used to be smaller, and they were like on rank and flank basis. What do you do with especially swaths of the Warhammer Fantasy range? Where do those models go? Do they sell them again so you can buy? I don't think that's practical. Then they'd have to keep all those molds around just for people to buy old world stuff, and I think they're making a calculated judgment that they're going to focus on making new models just for stuff intrinsic to Warhammer: The Old World. I don't think that most armies are getting revamped resin ranges.
Sure, sure, yeah. My hobby friends were we kind of said a similar thing of it'd be really cool to see the old world in a smaller scale. I think it would like suit the rank and flank, era and
Yeah.
style really well.
A lot of older historical miniatures games are in that smaller scale.
Yeah.
Armies are not generally 40 to 50 models. We are playing an abstraction of sorts in a war game. Especially when we're not even playing a war. We're playing like a singular battle between the two players in an afternoon. Most historical wargaming, if you go to a historical wargaming convention, especially those like out in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and stuff like that, the actual historical miniature gaming society for the U.S., you'll see you'll see gaming tables which are like 10, 15, 20 feet long, involve like a half dozen or more people, and they are playing relatively simple rules. They aren't using that much dice. It's different. It's different levels of abstraction, and they're taking command of trays which have the smaller scale, and they represent. It's like here's a company of 80 to 90 soldiers on a base the size of what for the 28 mil, which would fit like maybe 15 models. And so yeah, I do think that if Games Workshop were to develop something more fitting of the Napoleonic stuff, it would do better in a smaller scale.
So as we approach the end, I want to ask you a little more about terrain. I'm putting you on the spot here, but over the, you know, over your tournament experience, what are some of your favorite battlefields that you've played on that have been built out with terrain? Whether it was like the theme or aesthetic or the strategic, interests that it added. What were some of your favorite terrain tables that you've played on in your experience?
That is an easy question to answer, actually. There is a event in the Midwest which I wish I could attend more often, unfortunately, because it is quite cost prohibitive to get to this, unfortunately. Especially since now it's doubles only. It used to be singles, but the event is owned by one man, and he doesn't have all the money in the world, so he keeps it afloat by making sure that it runs twice a year, and now it's two sets of doubles events. One's usually at the beginning of February, and one is at the beginning of November, and they're called Holy Hammer events. So there's Holy Wars and Holy Havoc. They are generally like the talk of the Midwest. Most of the Adepticon staff that goes anywhere near Age of Sigmar attends them. They are definitely must see, and they aren't quite matched play events. They are definitely more casual in format, but competitive in mindset, because it's still the people with the most battle points get like best general trophy and such like that. However, it plays like Super Smash Brothers. I say that because every round you get one of two options. You either pick your table or you pick your opponent,
Huh.
and it goes in a descending order based on like whoever got the least amount of battle points last round, that team gets to pick first, and it goes in such. And so the Sharks, the teams who are trying to go for best general, they will find each other because they're trying to defeat the other Sharks to get the best general. So they're like going to avoid the people who are there for a good. Everyone's there for a good time. Now I say, do you pick your table? Because every table is its own stage. If you look up Holy Hammer events, it's actually its own website. I forget the name of the website, but if you just look up Holy Hammer Age of Sigmar, you'll probably see a logo from any one of the past few years. It was actually one of the first tournaments. Again, I use tournament likely. It really is just like a competitive game weekend. It's hard to define really. It was one of the first when the game came out, and I actually flew across the country to. It's in the middle of a cornfield. It's in Naperville, Illinois. It's like you're in a Hampton Inn. You look outside, cornfields. Not to bash cornfields. It's just that's how remote it is. He lives in central Illinois, outside of Chicagoland, and it was a great time. All of those tables are handmade by one man, and sometimes his kids help. They're like roughly they're like college age now, but like at the time they were high school age, and sometimes the kids help. Every table has a theme, and instead of having normal match play scenarios, every table has its own win condition. So sometimes terrain features come to life and attack players. All of them have like there's like a L'Oreal's Tree of Life, which the table is dominated by this giant terrain. It's each of them is like its own diorama. They all have drastically different themes. Some of them have nicknames because they're famously destructive to players. There's one table called the Miley Cyrus board because it has a famous wrecking ball. It has this tall pylon. They're hollow wooden hollow blocks which are covered in painted lightning and cosmic nebula and stuff like that. And whoever is going second in that battle round rolls 3 dice and gets to move the pillar in that direction that many inches. And whatever was under the pillar takes damage. And the win condition is do the most damage, period, with the pillar. So you can damage your own stuff, you can damage somebody else's. It's indiscriminate. And the way that you win that game is by doing the most damage with that moving pillar, which you don't always get to control and such like that. And so I really appreciate those tables, but that's a very special type of event where forget about terrain layouts, forget about symmetry, forget about fairness. You are there to experience each table like a stage in Super Smash Brothers. And the terrain will try and almost all the terrain on each of the tables will damage you. And sometimes it'll say you cannot take a save. No word saves, no nothing. Tournament rule. If you're taking damage, that's it. Your stuff's dying. And it leads to good fun. And on top of it being doubles, you get wacky combinations of some of the most talented hobbyists and most competitive hobbyists in our scene, duking it out on the table in these crazy combinations, trying to win in unconventional ways. If I could go to this event more often, I definitely would.
That sounds like so much fun. I love like when people add like weird custom elements like the terrain interaction into games. Actually, for
Mhm.
Wildlands Kickstarter, everybody in the chat, I did write some war game scenarios, and they have like two versions for skirmish and army scale, and I think there's one where like one of the swampy trees like runs around and attacks you, and Letitia and Janet did great graphics work on that, so that should be on the downloads page somewhere on the website, so check that out. But I gotta, well, we gotta wrap it up here pretty quick, but I have loved chatting wargaming with you.
For having me.
I've been doing, my hobby hangs mostly solo, so it's been super fun to have someone here to chat with. And I am the wargame guy at Dwarven Forge, so there's a lot of people that are getting interested in wargaming, but I'm kind of like the person leading them along. So it's super cool to see someone like so experienced in the world of the hobby and the tournaments and events, get to pick your brain a little bit. So thank you so much for spending your time with me here.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So, hey, everyone who has supported the Kickstarter, thank you so much for your support. If you're new to Dwarven Forge, find us on Kickstarter, Cities Untold, Lowtown, so much great. Roof geometry, scaffolding, verticality, brand new systems. Our YouTube channel has walkthrough videos on a bunch of sets and a bunch of piece functionality and all of that. So check out our YouTube page for that. And we will see you on stream next time. Look out for the stream schedule on the Discord and such. So